Zones of Control, Perspectives on Wargaming, edited by Pat Harrigan and Matthew Kirschenbaum. The section is The Hobby Traditions, from the chapter A Game Out of All Proportions by John Peterson. At a time when many young Americans idealistically rejected war, wargamers countered the counterculture and came to terms with war by immersing themselves in safe simulations of it. Overwhelming, these mid-century war games chose as their subject battles of the 19th and 20th centuries, and few explored any setting after the victorious Second World War. For youths who grew up with the threat of conscription or nuclear annihilation, the anachronistic warfare of the past must have seemed quaint and safe, totally under control. War games showed orderly conflicts still fought by soldiers, on battlefields or ships, conflicts from the days before war became something that could incinerate all the world's cities, civilians included, at the whim of some grim button pusher. Although the popular media painted the wargaming community as inherently pro-war, wargamers ran the gamut. Some were or became soldiers, but others adhered to the philosophy of Wells that little warfare encouraged pacifism. Board wargamers were few and far between, but since wargames required at least two players, a support network was badly needed. The miniature wargame community was tinier still. Subscription to Scrubby's Wargame Digest began at 40 and never exceeded 200, albeit many of its subscribers were prominent game designers. The miniature side of the hobby won many converts in the early 1960s thanks to books written in England by Don Featherstone, such as Wargames, 1962, or in America, Joe Morshower's How to Play Wargames in Miniature, 1962. But no amount of book learning could locate a wargaming opponent. The hobby linked itself together through four primary mechanisms: magazines, clubs, conventions, and letters. The Wargame Digest, first among these fan-made magazines, or fanzines, did not survive beyond 1963, but it had many successors. Featherstone founded his own Wargamers newsletter, which became the flagship monthly of the miniature wargame community for the next decade. Avalon Hill's own magazine, The General, famously carried an opponent's wanted column to connect wargamers. Many other magazines were published by clubs. Some clubs were local in scope, while others had greater ambitions, like the International Federation of Wargaming, formed in 1967. The IFW initially sponsored the most famous convention founded in the 1960s, the Lake Geneva Wargames Convention, or Gen Con, held in 1968 by Gary Gygax in his hometown in Wisconsin. Once game fans met through clubs or conventions, personal correspondents could carry play-by-mail game moves between distant opponents, overcoming the sparseness of gamers. No game lent itself to play-by-mail quite as naturally as diplomacy. In tabletop diplomacy, each player secretly commits their moves for a turn to paper, and then at the turn's end, all players simultaneously reveal their moves. But that is when everyone learns which promises have been honored and which have been merely a ruse. Famously, that is when the stabs occur that upset the balance of power in diplomacy. When troops you were expecting to join your coalition to oust an enemy instead go elsewhere, and a player you believe to be an ally turns out to be a traitor. When you play the game by post, these written instructions can be mailed to a central game authority, or game master, who is responsible for tracking the state of play and sharing the consequences of moves. Similarly, the negotiation phase of diplomacy can take the form of either private correspondence or public pronouncements sent to everyone, known as diplomacy propaganda. From the dawn of postal diplomacy, in the games run in the fanzines Graustark and Ruritania, propaganda unleashed the storytelling that was always latent in war games, and made the games as much about the character a player portrays as about the armies that one commands. As small as the hobby may have been, the core of energetic, creative people who flocked to conventions and fanzines constituted an invisible college to propose and evaluate improvements of wargames. Diplomacy demonstrated exceptional versatility as a platform for variance. Fans transposed the game from the early 20th century to medieval Europe, to Scottish clans, even to Middle-earth. Aspiring designers also expanded on the existing work of Avalon Hill, exploring new aspects of the historical battles or shifting to adjacent actions. Amateur game design became a large dimension of the hobby, albeit not a very lucrative one. The national clubs would even distribute promising amateur game designs to their membership though this yielded little remuneration other than esteem. Amid this wave of innovation in the 1960s, we see an increasing focus on smaller-scale combat and miniature wargames. This narrowed the scope of simulation from armies to soldiers, and from turns representing days to mere instants. An early work along these lines was Michael J. Korn's Modern War in Miniature, 1966, which positioned a player as an individual soldier, verbally proposing to a referee actions for a turn lasting a mere 2 seconds of game time. This trend reflected the changing scope of an American soldier's experience in combat, where command yielded to discretion. No longer were droves of American troops storming beaches like Normandy to wrest a foothold to confront an enemy army. Now in Vietnam, no opposing army was in sight, and small platoons struggled to ferret out enough opposition for a skirmish. A similar narrowing of scope came to board war games, especially in the vibrant amateur design community. For example, Mike Carr's pioneering Fight in the Skies, 1968, modeled aerial combat down to the actions of single planes and pilots in the First World War, inspired by the exploits of the Red Baron in the recent film The Blue Max, 1966. Similarly, Jim Dunnigan's tactical game 3, 1969, published through his Pultron Press, depicted World War II combat at the level of small tank detachments conflicting on a tactical scale. It reached a broad audience, and it shipped with Strategy and Tactics, a widely read wargame magazine that Dunnigan's company had recently acquired. Though Dunnigan would soon found Simulation Publications, Inc., Avalon Hill's main wargaming rival of the 1970s, Avalon Hill nonetheless regularly published his designs. A revised Tactical Games 3 appeared under their imprint as Panzerblitz in 1970, and became one of their most successful titles. As of 1983, it was the only Avalon Hill game to sell more than 200,000 copies. In the more experimental miniature community, hobbyists dared to model eras prior to Napoleon. Even before the Wargame Digest began, Tony Bath had published medieval miniature wargame rules in the British Model Soldier Society's bulletin. He ran sprawling campaigns based on a variety of unreal countries, even borrowing elements of Robert E. Howard's Hyborian Age, the setting of his famous Conan stories, to form an ancient setting wargame campaign, albeit one without supernatural elements. Bath's self-published ancient and medieval rules became a standard of the era. Gary Gygax had similar interests in the medieval period, which inspired him to form a wargaming club called the Castle and Crusade Society, as a subgroup of the IFW in 1970. Its newsletter, The Doomsday Book, circulated rules for various forms of medieval warfare, from mass frays via systems indebted to Bath to jousting and other types of single combat. The man-to-man fighting rules brought simulation down to the individual level, modeling the likelihood that medieval weapons would hit targets protected by various degrees of armor or armor classes, ranging from leather through chainmail and up to plate armor. Weapons as well varied from familiar swords and bows to exotic implements like halberds and morning stars. Players consulted a combat table and, for a given weapon used against a given set of armor, attempted to roll above a target number in order to score a hit. Gygax collected his various medieval rules ideas in Chainmail, 1971, one of the earliest standalone miniature rules booklets published in the United States. Fatefully, he added a supplement to the end of the book that catered to another of his interests, fantasy. The monumental popularity of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings saga in the late 1960s created an enormous fan community around fantasy literature, and Chainmail became the first commercial war game to provide rules for modeling wizards, dragons, orcs, elves, and similar fantastic elements. The rules included systems for both swords and sorcery. When an enemy spell targets a friendly unit, defending players roll a saving throw on dice charts that may prevent death, to simulate the resilience of characters like Aragorn or Conan. Heroes in Chainmail could survive up to 4 hits from weapons, and superheroes could survive 8. Chainmail polarized the wargaming community. While many rejected fantasy as something childish and insisted that wargames were a tool for exploring history or improving skills as a commander, others recognized the possibilities that were opened up by simulating the unreal. That players could do more than just read about fantastic adventures, they could also experience them. Removing wargames from modern conflicts like Vietnam had a certain appeal for a country weary of the ambiguities and atrocities shown in the daily media. Monsters like orcs are intrinsically evil, and players could slaughter them without moral quandaries. Gygax soon learned that a Twin Cities gamer and fellow member of the Castle and Crusade Society named Dave Arneson had applied the chainmail rules to a local campaign called Blackmoor, which included a dungeon populated with monsters that small groups of adventurers could attempt to plunder. After Arneson demonstrated the work to Gygax late in 1972, the pair began collaborating on an entirely new type of game based on these principles.